The message came through at exactly 0600 hours, and Admiral Richard Hayes read it 3 times before he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what it meant. The Vraxian ships had fired on the civilian transport from New Boston Colony, and there were no survivors among the 247 people who had been traveling home to Earth for the holidays. Richard sat in his command chair, aboard the EDF Retribution, and felt something cold settle into his chest, because his daughter Kate had been scheduled on that transport, and even though he knew she had changed her plans at the last minute, other fathers and mothers had lost their children today. Lieutenant Claire Morrison stood at her station with tears running down her face, but her hands remained steady on her controls. Captain Jacob Barnes approached Richard with a datapad containing the official report from the Vraxian commander, and the tone of the message made Richard's blood run cold because it was not an apology or even an explanation but rather a dismissal that called the incident a necessary security measure against potential Deathworlder aggression. The Vraxians had killed nearly 250 humans, and they were calling it security. For 15 years, humanity had endured the contempt of the Galactic Council, and Richard had been there for most of it, watching as Earth's diplomats swallowed insults and accepted unfair trade agreements, and listened to alien species call humans primitive savages who had barely earned the right to leave their violent little world. He had watched humanity try to play by the Council's rules, and follow their protocols, and submit proper complaints through proper channels, and every single time, the response had been the same, which was that Earth needed to understand its place in civilized society. Richard stood up from his command chair and walked to the main viewport where he could see the rest of the human fleet spread out across space like scattered stars. 47 warships carrying the hopes of a species that had climbed up from the mud and blood of a world that had tried to kill them for 200,000 years. Earth had forged humanity in fire and ice and storm and predator and disease, and now the galaxy was learning what that meant. He activated the fleet-wide communication channel, and his voice carried to every ship and every crew member who had been waiting for this moment. All ships, this is Admiral Hayes, and as of right now, the Earth Defense Force is declaring a state of war against the Vraxian hegemony, because we will not tolerate attacks on human lives anymore. For 15 years, we have followed their rules and accepted their insults, and tried to be the peaceful neighbors they claimed they wanted, but they have shown us that they see us as nothing more than animals to be controlled, destroyed. Today, the Deathworlders are going to remind the galaxy exactly what that word means. The response came immediately from 47 ships as crews that had been trained for war, but forced to endure peace finally received permission to do what they had been built to do. Commander Lisa Grant sent a message from the EDF Vengeance that simply said, "It was about time, sir." And Richard felt a grim satisfaction because his people understood what was at stake. Captain Helen Burke on the destroyer Defiance reported her ship ready for combat, and her crew eager to show the Vraxians what happened when you pushed humans too far. Down in the Marine Bay, Sergeant Danny Price was rallying his troops with a speech about how their training on Earth had prepared them for anything the galaxy could throw at them, because if you could survive Earth, you could survive anywhere. The young Marines listened with fierce attention, because many of them had lost friends or family to Vraxian harassment over the years. And they wanted payback for every insult, and every restriction, and every casual dismissal of human worth. Richard returned to his command chair and brought up the tactical display showing the Vraxian blockade around Kepler Station, where 3 human colony worlds were being held hostage by alien Arrogance. The Vraxians had 63 ships in perfect geometric formation, because that was how Council species fought their ritualized battles, with overlapping shields and predetermined engagement ranges, and formal declarations that gave everyone time to prepare. They had turned war into a dance with steps that everyone knew and rules that everyone followed. But humans had learned war from 10,000 years of fighting each other, and there were no rules when your survival was at stake. Richard looked at the Vraxian formation and saw not strength, but rigidity, and not power, but predictability, because they were so confident in their superiority that they could not imagine someone fighting differently. Captain Barnes stood beside him and studied the same display with the eyes of a man who had grown up reading about Thermopylae and Normandy and Gettysburg and 1,000 other battles where humans had learned that sometimes the only way to win was to do what your enemy never expected. The fleet began its acceleration toward Kepler Station, and Richard felt the familiar weight of command settle onto his shoulders because he was about to lead humanity into its first real war against an alien species. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and facing an enemy with technology developed over thousands of years. But Richard had studied history, and he knew that superior technology did not always win, because determination and creativity and pure, stubborn refusal to surrender could overcome almost any advantage. Lieutenant Kevin Ross at the tactical station was running calculations for attack vectors that violated every Council warfare doctrine, and Richard approved every single one, because following the enemy's rules was how you lost. The plan they had developed would cost human lives, and Richard knew that some of the ships under his command would not survive the next few hours, but that was the price of freedom, and every person in the fleet had volunteered, knowing the risks. As the Retribution surged forward through space, Richard thought about his daughter Kate, and about all the other children of Earth who deserved to grow up in a galaxy that respected them rather than dismissed them. He thought about the 247 people who had died on the New Boston transport, and about every human who had ever been insulted or restricted or harassed by aliens who thought themselves superior. The Vraxians had made the mistake of believing that Deathworlders were primitive and weak, and Richard was about to teach them the most important lesson humanity had learned from Earth, which was that the most dangerous thing in the universe was a survivor who had nothing left to lose. Commander Zexthor watched the human fleet approach on his display screens and felt nothing but amusement at their crude attempt at military formation. The humans were charging forward in what appeared to be complete chaos, with ships scattered across multiple vectors and no coherent battle line that he could identify. This was exactly what he had expected from a species that had barely mastered space travel and thought they could challenge the might of the Vraxian hegemony, which had been perfecting warfare for 6,000 years. His tactical officer seemed less certain as he studied the human approach and pointed out that their vectors did not match any known Council combat doctrine. Zexthor dismissed the concern with a wave, because of course the humans did not follow proper doctrine since they were primitives who had no understanding of civilized warfare. They were going to learn today what happened when Deathworld savages tried to fight against a superior species. Aboard the Retribution, Admiral Richard Hayes studied the Vraxian formation with Captain Barnes and Lieutenant Ross, and they all saw the same weakness, which was that the enemy had arranged themselves according to thousands of years of tradition. The Vraxians expected humanity to follow the same rules, which meant formal positioning and shield exchanges and careful maneuvering at safe distances. Richard smiled without humor because humans had not learned warfare from rules and traditions but from necessity and desperation, and the simple fact that on Earth, if you did not adapt, you died. Captain Barnes highlighted several points in the Vraxian formation where their overlapping shields created strong defenses against conventional attacks, but left gaps that could be exploited if someone was willing to get close enough. Lieutenant Ross had calculated that they could break the formation if 3 squadrons were willing to accept heavy casualties in exchange for creating openings for the rest of the fleet. Richard approved the plan because this was how humans fought, which was not with caution and restraint but with calculated sacrifice when necessary. The human fleet suddenly scattered even further, and to the Vraxians, it looked like panic, as if the primitive Deathworlders were already breaking before the battle had even begun. Zexthor ordered his ships to maintain their perfect geometric formation and waited for the humans to exhaust themselves in futile attacks. He was so confident that he was already composing the report he would send to the Hegemony Council about how easily they had crushed the human rebellion. Then Commander Lisa Grant led the Vengeance and her squadron directly at the center of the Vraxian formation in what appeared to be a suicidal charge. The Vraxians concentrated their fire on Grant's ships and scored several hits that would have destroyed lesser vessels. But the human ships kept coming because their crews knew that their job was not to survive, but to draw enemy attention. Grant's voice came over the command channel, calm and steady, as she reported taking heavy damage, but maintaining course because that was what the plan required. While the Vraxians focused on the frontal assault, 3 other squadrons came in from angles that Council warfare doctrine said were impossible because they required flying too close to Kepler Station and using the nearby asteroids as cover. Captain Helen Burke on the Defiance led her squadron through a gap so narrow that her shields scraped against the station's hull, and her navigator was screaming warnings, but Burke ignored them because precision mattered more than safety. She brought her ship into position where the Vraxian shields overlapped and created a weak point that lasted only seconds, but that was all the time she needed. The human railguns fired at point-blank range, and the primitive weapons that Council species had dismissed as crude suddenly proved their worth because they punched through the shield gap with kinetic force that energy weapons could not match. The Vraxian command ship shuddered under impacts that cracked its hull and sent atmosphere venting into space. Zex Thor stared at his damage reports in disbelief, because this was not how battles were supposed to work, and the humans were not following any of the rules that made warfare predictable and manageable. Admiral Hayes coordinated the chaos from the Retribution with the calm of someone who had studied human military history and understood that battles were won not by following rules, but by breaking them. He sent orders to Wing 3 to execute what he called Morrison's Gambit, which was named after a battle where a smaller human force had defeated a larger one through unconventional tactics. Wing 5 received orders to begin a pattern called Alamo, which was named after a battle where humans had fought to the last man and taken far more enemies with them than should have been possible. These were tactics that had been developed over thousands of years of humans fighting humans, and they had names that meant something to the crews who executed them because they understood the history and the sacrifice and the stubborn refusal to surrender that had defined humanity's climb to the stars. The Vraxians had nothing in their databases that could counter these tactics because they had never faced an enemy that fought this way. Lieutenant Morrison coordinated the fighter squadrons and sent them swarming into the Vraxian formation like angry insects that refused to follow predictable patterns. The Vraxian point defense systems were designed to prioritize targets based on threat assessment and optimal firing solutions, but they became overwhelmed when 300 human fighters all attacked from different angles at different fire speeds with different objectives. Pilot Officer Greg Turner dove his fighter through a gap that his computer said was impossible and destroyed a Vraxian weapons array from inside their shield perimeter. The perfect Vraxian formation began to collapse as ships broke from their assigned positions to deal with threats that came from everywhere at once. Within 20 minutes, Zex Thor's command ship was crippled, and 12 other Vraxian vessels had been destroyed or disabled. Within 40 minutes, the remaining Vraxian ships were retreating in disorder, which was something that had not happened in Council warfare for over 3 centuries. Because battles were supposed to be controlled and predictable and end with negotiated surrenders rather than chaotic routes. Admiral Hayes stood on the bridge of the Retribution and surveyed the tactical display, showing the scattered remains of the Vraxian blockade fleet. They had won, but the cost had been heavy. With 17 human ships damaged and 3 destroyers completely destroyed, with all hands lost. Nearly 800 humans had died in 40 minutes of brutal combat. And Richard felt the weight of every single death, because he had ordered them into battle, knowing that some would not return. Captain Barnes approached with the casualty reports, and his expression was grim because he knew many of the officers who had died. Richard took the reports and read each name, because that was his duty as commander to remember the people who had given their lives. Then he ordered a message prepared for transmission to Earth and the Galactic Council, because it was time to make clear what humanity's position was going to be. The message went out an hour later, and it was brief because humans had never needed many words to express simple truths. Humanity will no longer accept attacks on our people, and we offer one opportunity for peace, which is to withdraw from all human territories and recognize our sovereignty or face the consequences. We are the species that conquered a death world, and you should not make us remind you what that means. The galaxy received that message, and for the first time since humans had reached the stars, the other species began to understand what they were dealing with. The Galactic Council chamber on Sanctum Prime had never seen such chaos in the 5,000 years since the Threeshi Concordat had established it as the center of galactic diplomacy. Representatives from 47 different species filled the concentric circles, arguing and gesturing and demanding attention, while High Arbiter Velmara tried to restore order. The humans had done something that was not supposed to be possible, which was defeat a major council species in open warfare, and now every species in the chamber was trying to figure out what that meant for the careful balance of power they had maintained for millennia. Ambassador Krelnoth of the Vraxian hegemony stood at his delegation's platform with barely contained rage radiating from his form. He demanded that the council impose immediate sanctions on humanity for their unprovoked aggression against Vraxian forces, and he called for a joint council fleet to be assembled to teach the primitives their place. His voice carried across the chamber as he described how the humans had violated every rule of civilized warfare and fought with brutal tactics that had not been seen in council space for thousands of years. Ambassador Peter Hughes of Earth stood calmly at the human delegation platform, which had been moved from the outer ring to the inner circle overnight because even the council staff understood that something fundamental had changed. Peter was a former military officer who had served in the early colony defense forces before becoming a diplomat, and he had the bearing of someone who understood both war and peace. Beside him stood Captain Jacob Barnes, who had been granted special permission to attend as a representative of the Defense Force, and Dr. Susan Blake, who was humanity's leading expert on alien species. High Arbiter Velmara called the chamber to order and recognized Ambassador Krelnoth, who immediately launched into a detailed account of the Battle of Kepler Station. He described how the humans had attacked without proper formal declaration and used tactics that were designed to maximize casualties rather than achieve honorable victory. He claimed that 12 Vraxian ships had been destroyed, and thousands of Vraxian lives had been lost to human barbarism, and he demanded justice for this crime against galactic peace. Peter listened to the entire speech without interruption, and when Velmara recognized him, he spoke in a clear voice that carried throughout the chamber. The Vraxian hegemony fired upon and destroyed a civilian transport, carrying 247 unarmed humans, including families with children returning home for the holidays. For 15 years, humanity has endured insults and trade restrictions and territorial violations while following every council protocol and filing every proper complaint and being dismissed at every turn. The Vraxians crossed a line when they killed our civilians, and we responded in the only way that would make them understand that we are not victims to be abused. The chamber erupted in arguments again, as various species debated whether the human response was proportional to the provocation. The militant Korvax clans expressed interest in humanity's tactical innovations, while the peaceful Delphini collective called for mediation and restraint. The technologically advanced Luminar collective expressed concern about the destabilizing effect that human military capabilities might have on galactic security. Velmara raised her crystalline appendages for silence and addressed Peter directly. Ambassador Hughes, the Council operates on principles of proportional response and civilized discourse, and warfare has not been prosecuted in the manner we witnessed at Kepler Station in our recorded history. Your tactics are considered barbaric by Council standards, and your willingness to accept casualties that we would find unacceptable is deeply troubling. How do you justify such brutal methods? Peter activated a holographic display that showed Earth rotating slowly in space, and the chamber fell silent as they watched humanity's homeworld. High Arbiter, with respect, your standards were developed by species who evolved on worlds where the greatest threat was resource scarcity or environmental stability. You have never had to face the challenges that forged humanity into what we are. Our world has tried to kill us since we first became conscious, and we survived by learning to fight back against everything that threatened us. The display shifted to show images of Earth's predators and natural disasters and the diseases that had shaped human evolution. We face creatures that hunt us for food and weather systems that can destroy entire cities and earthquakes that split the ground beneath our feet, and diseases that killed billions of our ancestors. We evolved alongside dangers that would terrify most council species, and we learned that the universe does not care about your plans or your protocols or your desire for civilized behavior. It will kill you without hesitation unless you are strong enough to survive. Dr. Blake stepped forward and added her expertise to Peter's explanation. Every species in this council evolved on paradise worlds compared to Earth, and your greatest evolutionary pressures taught you cooperation and resource management. Earth taught us something different, which is that if you cannot adapt and fight and overcome, then you die. For 200,000 years, our world tested every generation, and those who were too weak or too slow or too gentle did not survive to pass on their genes. We are the descendants of survivors, and that is why we fight the way we do. Captain Barnes spoke next, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen combat. You call our tactics barbaric, but we call them effective, because we learned warfare by fighting the only opponent that could truly challenge us, which was ourselves. For 10,000 years humans fought humans, and we got very good at it because the alternative was extinction. We learned that sometimes you have to accept casualties to achieve victory, and sometimes you have to sacrifice yourself so that others can survive, and sometimes the only way to win is to do what your enemy thinks is impossible. Ambassador Six Tara of the Luminar Collective spoke in her synthesized voice. The human perspective is enlightening, but the fact remains that your military capabilities are concerning, and your unpredictability makes you a potential threat to galactic stability. How can the Council trust a species that fights without regard for the conventions that have maintained peace for millennia? Peter's expression hardened. Ambassador Six Tara, you can trust us to defend ourselves and protect our people, which is exactly what any species would do when threatened. The difference is that we are honest about what we are capable of, rather than hiding behind rituals and conventions that make warfare seem civilized. There is nothing civilized about killing, and we do not pretend otherwise. When the Vraxians attacked our civilians, they triggered instincts that have kept humanity alive since before we had language, and those instincts told us to fight back with everything we have. High Arbiter Velmara considered the situation carefully because she understood that the old balance of power was shifting and that humanity represented something new in galactic affairs. What are humanity's terms for peace? She asked, and the chamber fell silent as everyone waited for the answer. Peter transmitted a document to all delegates. First, immediate Vraxian withdrawal from all human territories. Second, recognition of human sovereignty over our colonies and shipping lanes. Third, equal representation in council trade agreements with no discriminatory restrictions. Fourth, and this is absolutely non-negotiable, any future attack on human civilians will be considered an act of war against all humanity, and we will respond with overwhelming force. These are our terms, and they are not subject to negotiation because we have already proven that we can enforce them. The chamber erupted once more, as delegates argued about the unprecedented nature of humanity's demands. Krelnoth declared that the Vraxian hegemony would never accept such terms from primitives who barely understood the weapons they were using. Peter smiled coldly and suggested that the Vraxians review the tactical data from Kepler Station very carefully, because those had been humanity's older ships using less advanced weapons, and the newer fleet was currently being tactical data commissioned at Earth. He let that sink in before continuing. Humanity prefers peace, because we came to the stars, hoping to find friends and trade partners and opportunities to learn and grow. But we will not be victims, and we will not bow to arrogance, and we will not permit attacks on our people. The choice is yours, which is peace as equals, or war, with a species that has spent 200,000 years learning how to survive against impossible odds. We have been fighting since before your civilizations existed, and we are very good at it. The session continued for many hours as delegates debated and argued, and tried to find some way to restore the old order. But Peter remained firm on humanity's terms. When it finally ended, he received communications from several ambassadors who wanted to establish better relations with Earth. The Korvax clans wanted to discuss tactical exchanges, and the Luminar Collective wanted to study human problem-solving methods, and even some of the species that had previously dismissed humanity were now interested in establishing trade relationships. Peter sent a secure communication to Admiral Hayes and reported that the Council was listening but that the Vraxians were not going to accept peace. Richard's response was brief, which was that the fleet was ready for whatever came next, because humanity had learned long ago that some enemies would never stop until they were completely defeated. 3 weeks after the Battle of Kepler Station, the Vraxian hegemony launched their response with a fleet of over 200 warships, representing the largest military force assembled in Council space in more than 1,000 years. Their target was New Terra, which was humanity's primary agricultural colony, with 12 million civilians, and represented the foundation of Earth's expansion beyond the home system. The Vraxians intended to strike at humanity's heart and force surrender through economic starvation and the threat of massive civilian casualties. Admiral Richard Hayes received the intelligence reports aboard the Retribution, which was now part of a defensive fleet of 90 human warships positioned around New Terra. Captain Jacob Barnes stood beside him studying the tactical display that showed the incoming Vraxian force and doing calculations about their chances. 200 ships against 90 was not good odds even for humans who were used to fighting outnumbered. But the defense of New Terra was not negotiable, because losing the colony would cripple humanity's expansion for decades. Lieutenant Claire Morrison coordinated the defense network from her station and reported that all orbital platforms were online and charged. The ground-based railgun batteries that had been installed after Kepler Station were ready to fire, and the fighter squadrons were prepared for launch. But 200 Vraxian ships represented firepower that could overwhelm any static defense, which meant that Admiral Hayes needed to find a way to even the odds through tactics rather than brute force. Richard called a conference with all ship commanders and the ground force commander, Colonel Frank Patterson, who was responsible for coordinating the surface defenses and the colonial militia. He told them that the Vraxians were coming with everything they had because they believed overwhelming numbers would crush humanity's will to fight. But he reminded them that humans were at their most dangerous when cornered, because Earth had taught them that surrender meant death, and fighting meant at least a chance at survival. Captain Helen Burke of the Defiance asked what the tactical plan was, and Richard showed them a defense strategy that would have baffled any Council military theorist. Instead of forming a defensive line around New Terra, the human fleet would scatter into small task forces with specific targeting priorities and rally points. They would use the planet's gravity well and its 3 moons as cover, and they would strike at the Vraxian fleet from multiple angles simultaneously to prevent the enemy from using their numerical advantage effectively. The Vraxian fleet arrived in system under the command of Fleetmaster Drakthar, who had been given the mission to restore Vraxian honor after the humiliation at Kepler Station. He surveyed the tactical display with satisfaction, as he noted that the human fleet appeared scattered and disorganized with no coherent defensive formation visible. He interpreted this as panic and incompetence, rather than recognizing it as a deliberate tactical choice by an enemy that thought about warfare differently than Council species. Drakthar ordered his fleet to advance in the traditional Vraxian sphere formation, with overlapping shields and coordinated firing patterns that had dominated Council warfare for 6,000 years. His ships moved forward confidently toward New Terra's orbital space, where they would begin bombardment of military targets and force the humans to surrender before too many civilians died. He was already composing the victory report he would send to the Hegemony Council about how he had succeeded where Zex Thor had failed. Then humanity sprang their trap and showed the Vraxians that they still had not learned what it meant to fight Deathworlders. Captain Burke led her squadron out from behind New Terra's largest moon at maximum acceleration and drove straight into the center of the Vraxian sphere formation. 6 human destroyers and 8 frigates charged directly into the heart of the enemy fleet, accepting devastating fire that destroyed 2 ships immediately. But the remaining vessels did not stop or retreat because their mission was not survival, but disruption, and they drove deep into the Vraxian formation, where the overlapping shields created interference patterns that reduced defensive effectiveness. Simultaneously, Commander Lisa Grant led another squadron in a high-speed attack on the Vraxian rear, targeting their supply ships and carriers. Her orders were to force the enemy to choose between defending their logistics or maintaining formation coherence. The Vraxians had never faced an enemy that would sacrifice ships deliberately to create tactical opportunities, and Drakthar found his perfect formation beginning to fracture as ships broke away to deal with multiple threats. Admiral Hayes coordinated 9 separate attack vectors from the Retribution and sent orders that exploited every gap in the Vraxian response. Wing 7 executed a maneuver that brought them through New Terra's atmosphere, where the friction heated their shields to critical levels but allowed them to approach the enemy from an angle that orbital mechanics said should be impossible. Wing 4 began their attack, run through the densest part of the Vraxian formation, accepting casualties in exchange for close-range firing opportunities. 300 human fighters launched from carrier bays and planetary bases and swarmed the Vraxian fleet like insects attacking a larger predator. The Vraxian point defense systems were designed to prioritize targets based on threat assessment, but became overwhelmed when hundreds of small, fast-moving fighters attacked from every direction simultaneously. Pilot Officer Greg Turner led his squadron through gaps in the enemy formation that his computer warned were too dangerous, but he ignored the warnings because human pilots had learned to trust their instincts over machine calculations. The battle evolved into chaos that favored humanity because humans had learned to fight in chaos, while the Vraxians had spent millennia perfecting order. For 14 hours, the two fleets tore at each other in orbital space around New Terra, while 12 million civilians sheltered in underground bunkers and watched their defenders fight for their survival. Colonel Patterson coordinated the ground-based railgun batteries to fire at any Vraxian ship that tried to break through for a bombardment run. When a Vraxian battleship managed to fight through the defensive lines and positioned itself to begin orbital bombardment of New Terra's capital city, Captain Barnes made a decision. He ordered all power to forward shields and set a ramming course for the enemy battleship. Admiral Hayes realized what his second-in-command was planning and relieved Barnes of duty so he could take manual control of the Retribution himself. He ordered all non-essential personnel to evacuate in escape pods while he aimed the massive flagship directly at the Vraxian battleship. The collision happened at combat velocity with 800,000 tons of human warship impacting Vraxian shields at speeds that made the impact force equal to a small nuclear weapon. Both vessels became debris in an explosion that lit up the sky over New Terra's capital, but the city below was saved. 12 million people watched their admiral sacrifice himself to protect them, and they understood in that moment what humanity meant when they said that no one would be left behind. Captain Barnes survived the evacuation and found himself aboard the Vengeance as the ranking officer of what remained of the human fleet. He coordinated the final stages of the battle while dealing with the knowledge that Richard Hayes, who had been his friend and mentor, was gone. The human fleet had been reduced to 48 operational ships, and over 15,000 humans had died in the longest space battle in human history. But the Vraxian fleet had been shattered with over 130 ships destroyed or disabled. Fleetmaster Drakthar stared at his tactical display in disbelief, because he had brought overwhelming force and followed proper doctrine and done everything that 6,000 years of Vraxian military tradition said would guarantee victory. Yet the humans had defeated him through sheer determination and willingness to sacrifice and tactical creativity that his people had forgotten was possible. The surviving Vraxian ships retreated from New Terra, and Captain Barnes sent a message to Earth and the Galactic Council. We held the line, and New Terra stands, and humanity will never surrender, because we learned on Earth that survival is not negotiable. Admiral Richard Hayes gave his life to save 12 million people, and his sacrifice represents everything that makes humanity strong, which is that we protect our own, no matter the cost. The Vraxians came with 200 ships and left with fewer than 70. And they learned today what every species in this galaxy needs to understand, which is that you do not attack Deathworlders unless you are prepared to face the consequences. The debris field around New Terra contained the wreckage of over 150 ships from both sides and represented the largest space battle in galactic history. Among that debris was the remains of the Retribution and the body of Admiral Richard Hayes, who had shown the galaxy what human leadership meant. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened 2 days after the Battle of New Terra, and the atmosphere in the chamber was completely different from the previous meeting. Representatives from 47 species gathered in silence rather than argument, because they had all received the tactical data from the battle and understood that something fundamental had changed in galactic affairs. A major council species had been defeated twice by newcomers, and the implications were staggering for the careful balance of power that had existed for millennia. High Arbiter Velmara called the session to order and recognized Ambassador Peter Hughes, who entered the chamber with Captain Jacob Barnes and Dr. Susan Blake. The human delegation's platform had been moved to the innermost circle of the chamber, which was normally reserved for the oldest and most influential species. No one objected to the placement because everyone understood that humanity had earned their position through blood and sacrifice rather than politics and negotiation. Ambassador Krelnoth of the Vraxian hegemony stood at his platform, looking diminished and defeated. The hegemony acknowledges defeat, he said, and each word seemed to cause him physical pain. We underestimated the humans and assumed our technological superiority and numerical advantage would prevail. But we were wrong. The Vraxian military has lost over 100,000 personnel, and our fleet capacity has been reduced by more than half. We cannot continue this war. Peter stood and addressed the council in a calm voice that carried throughout the chamber. Humanity did not seek this war, and we came to the stars, hoping for peaceful coexistence with other species. But we will not permit attacks on our people, and we will not bow to arrogance from species that believe their age gives them the right to dismiss us. The Battle of New Terra cost 15,000 human lives, including Admiral Richard Hayes, who sacrificed himself to save 12 million civilians. These losses will echo through our culture for generations, but they prove that humanity will always defend its own. High Arbiter Velmara spoke carefully, because she understood that the old order was ending, and a new era was beginning. The Council has reviewed the human proposals submitted 3 weeks ago, and in light of recent events, we are prepared to discuss acceptance of your terms. Ambassador Hughes. What does humanity require for peace? Peter transmitted the same document he had presented before. First, immediate Vraxian withdrawal from all human territories, and formal recognition that those territories belong to humanity. Second, acknowledgement of human sovereignty over our colonies and shipping lanes with no interference or inspection requirements. Third, equal representation in all Council trade agreements with the same terms offered to other species. Fourth, any future attack on human civilians will be considered an act of war against all humanity and will result in military response. He paused and looked around the chamber. These terms are not negotiable, because we have proven that we can enforce them through military action if necessary. But humanity prefers peace to war and cooperation to conflict. We want to trade with you and learn from you and share what we know. We want to explore the galaxy together and discover new worlds and make the universe better for all species. But we will do these things as equals or not at all. Ambassador Sixtara of the Luminar Collective spoke in her synthesized voice. The Council understands your position, Ambassador Hughes, and your species has demonstrated capabilities that we cannot ignore. But you must also understand our concern, because your willingness to accept casualties and your tactical unpredictability make you unlike any species we have encountered. How can we build trust with a species that fights the way you do? Dr. Blake stepped forward to answer. Ambassador Sixtara, you build trust with humanity the same way you would with any species, which is through honest dealing and mutual respect. We fight the way we do because Earth taught us that survival requires strength and adaptability. But we also learned cooperation and compassion because humans, who could not work together, did not survive. We are capable of great violence when threatened, but we are also capable of great kindness when treated fairly. The choice of which side of humanity you see is largely up to you. Captain Barnes added his perspective as someone who had commanded ships in both battles. Every human who serves in the Defense Force volunteers knowing the risks because we believe that protecting our people is worth dying for. That is not barbarism, that is duty and honor and love for our families and our species. We do not seek death, but we do not fear it either because Earth taught us that sometimes the only way to protect what matters is to be willing to sacrifice yourself. Admiral Hayes understood that, and his sacrifice saved 12 million lives. The Council chamber remained silent as delegates absorbed the human perspective and tried to reconcile it with their own cultural values. Finally, High Arbiter Velmara made her decision. The Council accepts humanity's terms in full, and the Vraxian hegemony will withdraw from all human territories immediately. Human sovereignty is recognized, and trade agreements will be renegotiated with human participation as equals. Attacks on human civilians are declared a violation of Council law, subject to collective enforcement. She paused, and her crystalline form seemed to shimmer with emotion. Furthermore, the Council extends an invitation for humanity to join as a full member species with all rights and responsibilities that entails. You have proven yourselves capable of defending your interests and worthy of equal status among the galactic community. We hope you will accept this invitation and help shape the future of galactic civilization. Peter glanced at Captain Barnes and Dr. Blake before responding. The Earth government will need to review this invitation formally, but I am authorized to say that humanity is honored by the offer. We look forward to working with all Council species as partners and equals in exploring and protecting this galaxy. The session continued for hours, working through details of treaties and territorial boundaries and trade frameworks. When it finally ended, Peter found himself approached by various ambassadors who wanted to establish better relations with Earth Ambassador Tirgon of the warrior Korvax clans offered a traditional greeting and said that humanity had reminded them of something important, which was that peace required strength to defend it. The Korvax would be honored to establish military exchanges with humanity. Even Ambassador Six Tara approached and expressed interest in learning from human problem-solving methods. The Luminar Collective valued knowledge above all else, and recognized that humanity had unique perspectives worth studying. "Perhaps we can learn from each other," she suggested, and Peter agreed that mutual learning would benefit both species. Back on Earth, the news of the Council's acceptance of human terms was met with relief that the war had ended, and grief for the 15,000 who had died. In particular, the loss of Admiral Richard Hayes was felt deeply, because he had become a symbol of human determination and sacrifice. A ceremony was held at Arlington National Cemetery where Kate Hayes accepted her father's posthumous award of the Star of Terra, which was humanity's highest military honor. Captain Barnes attended the ceremony in dress uniform, along with Commander Grant and dozens of other officers who had served under Admiral Hayes. As the honor guard played their tribute, Barnes remembered his last conversation with Richard aboard the Retribution. "We did not start this war, but we will finish it," his friend had said. "And when we do, humanity will stand as equals in the galaxy." That promise had been kept through the sacrifice of 15,000 lives. 6 months later, humanity officially joined the Galactic Council as a full member species. Ambassador Peter Hughes established the human embassy on Sanctum Prime and began the work of building relationships with dozens of alien species. The Earth Defense Force continued to patrol human space, but now they did so as a recognized, legitimate military force rather than primitive Deathworld defenders. New ships were commissioned, and new crews were trained, because humanity understood that peace required strength to maintain. But the greatest change was in how the galaxy viewed Earth and its children. No longer were humans dismissed as barbaric primitives from a violent little world. They were recognized as a species that had earned its place through sacrifice and determination, and an unbreakable will to protect their own. In the council chambers, a new saying began to circulate among the various species, which was, "Do not anger the Deathworlders, because they have forgotten how to surrender." On New Terra, a monument was erected, where the Retribution had made its final stand. The inscription was simple, but powerful. "Here, Admiral Richard Hayes and 15,000 humans defended our home and taught the galaxy what it means to be human. Remember them and honor them, and never forget what they gave us." Every year on the anniversary of the battle, 12 million people gathered at the monument to remember the price of freedom. And across human space from Earth to the newest colonies, children learned about the battles of Kepler Station and New Terra. They learned about Admiral Hayes and Captain Barnes and Commander Grant and all the crews who had fought impossible odds. They learned about the day humanity declared to the galaxy that they would bow to no one. The age of human exploration had begun, and it had been purchased with blood and sacrifice and the determination of a species that had climbed from a death world to stand among the stars as equals.